Right. Order, order. And can I welcome our first witness to this session in Edinburgh of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee of the House of Commons from Westminster. And we are looking at the relationships within the United Kingdom between the four parliaments, if they're all sitting, and the four governments, if they're all constituted, and in particular at the EU Withdrawal Bill and the issues arising from the UK's leaving the European Union. And I wonder if you could, first of all, introduce yourself for the record, please.
My name is Michael Keating. I'm Professor of Politics at the University of Aberdeen and Director of the Centre on Constitutional Change.
And I should say that we had hoped that another witness would be sitting with you. Unfortunately, she's been detained by a family matter. And so we'll have to ask you the questions we'd have put to her as well, and we'll try and make it clear what we're asking. To start with, can I ask that Professor McHarg argued that while the UK is formally a unitary state, there's always been aspects of diversity within the UK constitution. And she uses a phrase, unity and diversity in the constitution. Slightly unfair to ask you what she meant, but perhaps you have a view on that.
Yes, I do. I'm a political scientist. Aileen McHarg is a lawyer, but I think we probably have a similar view on this, that there's an ambiguity in the UK constitution which goes way back at least to the Treaty of Union between England and Scotland forming the United Kingdom as to whether this is a unitary state in which the principle of parliamentary sovereignty really is the be-all and end-all of the constitution, or whether it is a union in which sovereignty is shared, in which there are historic understandings amongst the nations as to the nature of the constitution itself. And that has even been raised in a famous case in the Court of Session here back in 1953, McCormick versus the Lord Advocate. But it was something that didn't really have any resonance in politics until devolution, when the multinational nature of the United Kingdom was given an institutional expression, and referendums were held in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to back up plans for devolution. They passed, and therefore there is a view that that has changed our understanding of the Constitution, that is a union of diversity, that there's a division of power, and that we must rethink what we mean by Westminster sovereignty. Now, that's one way of thinking about the Constitution. The other way of thinking about the Constitution, which is actually in the Devolution Acts, is that Westminster is still supreme. There's a difference of opinion. And because most of our Constitution doesn't hinge upon black-letter law, it hinges upon conventions, the question is there, what conventions do we have? Now, because there are those very different views of the Constitution, there's been a practice in the last 20 years to try and not confront that issue where possible. The Sewell Convention is a way of doing that. Let's respect the devolved powers as far as possible. Let's not take things to the Supreme Court. The UK government has never gone to the Supreme Court over a Scottish Act. It's done so once or twice in Wales. So let those conventions develop and grow. And if there are different understandings of the Constitution in different parts of the United Kingdom, we can live with those and just get around them politically. Now, BrExit makes that more difficult because BrExit is a shock to the Constitution, and certain things have to be written down which were not written down in the past. And that is how we've got to the situation we are in this week, where there is still a dispute between the Scottish and UK governments about this question of really where ultimate authority lies or should lie.
Well, that was a tremendous answer. I don't feel I need to ask anything else, and if anybody else wants to ask a supplementary on that, I think we'll move straight on. And to... Oh, sorry, who? Oh, right. Okay. Oh, yes, I ought to just bring in the question of Northern Ireland, because that presents particular challenges and perhaps of minor interest to most people. Of course, whereas in the island of Great Britain, we have a single civil service, Ireland has a separate civil service for historical reasons. So And of course, the history of Ireland and of Northern Ireland presents particular challenges of diversity. So how can they be accommodated within the UK constitution outside the EU in the same way as you describe for the rest of the United Kingdom?
Well, the same problem arises there because we have a peace agreement in Northern Ireland and a power-sharing form of government that rests upon quite a bit of suspension of disbelief, and different sides buy into it for different reasons. So that nationalists who accepted the border in Northern Ireland and the unionists who accepted an Irish dimension, they may interpret that rather differently, but they both put aside their long-term aims in favour of an agreement because they realise that neither side has won that particular argument. Now, the Good Friday Agreement and the European single market are two separate things, but they've complemented each other in many ways, because with the European single market, it's been possible to give some substance to the Good Friday Agreement, notably by opening up the border. The border exists, the border is recognised, the border has not gone away, but it's been transformed and opened up. And then it's allowed all island institutions to develop without challenging the notion of British sovereignty, an all-island electricity market, all-island agricultural markets, development of close economic links between the North and the South. So they've been complementary, and that's given rise to two interpretations of what happens after Brexit, and the UK government has tended to take a rather narrow view that whatever does must preserve the Good Friday Agreement as written, whereas the Irish government has taken a more extensive interpretation to say the Brexit Agreement must preserve everything that has developed in the 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement. So the implications are disputed.
I think everybody agrees that we don't want any infrastructure at the border in Northern Ireland. Given that the former president of the World Customs Organization, the head of the HMRC, the head of the Irish Revenue, Neil Cody, have all said a frictionless border without infrastructure is possible. What do you make of the insistence on the new Republican government in the Republic of Ireland, which has got a different policy from Enda Kenny's government, and the European Union insisting that there has to be infrastructure at the border if we have regulatory divergence from the rest of the EU?
Well, I don't think the issue is the physical border. The issue is the existence of a border, whether it's physical or not. And if you use technology to avoid a physical wall at the border, if you've still got regulatory divergence, it's a border. That obstructs trade, it creates complications for the single agricultural market, the single energy market. It will require ways to manage that border. The fact that they are controlled electronically or on the ground is really a secondary issue. Those are different ways of managing the border, but they're not ways of eliminating the border.
Well, all the transactions of goods across the border have to be registered electronically anyway through the Intrastat system, the European Intrastat system, so that any transaction across a border between a member state within the European Union has to be recorded on a system and logged, and there are different rates of VAT that have to be dealt with, and there is obviously an excise duty border. There is livestock movements already have to be checked across the border. You can't move livestock across the Northern Ireland border without being subject to checks. So this isn't a Rubicon we're crossing here.
No, this is why I say that the physical border is not actually the issue.
I think the physical border is the issue.
But if you have different regulatory systems, different standards for animal health or agricultural products and so on, then that becomes an obstacle.
Well,
even if you get rid of the physical border.
We already have different regulatory standards for animal health, for example. We have higher regulatory standards in the Republic of Ireland. So I'm just wondering, if we can resolve this without physical infrastructure at the border, surely that would be sufficient.
Yeah, well, you have mutual recognition in most regulatory systems.
Mutual recognition.
And so that and therefore...
being different from regulatory alignment.
There's been a lot of exegesis of words, regulatory alignment, no regulatory divergence, and so on. But the broad principle is mutual recognition and compatibility. That's the problem there. There's also a political issue in that whether it's the customs union or the single market, which is mainly about regulation, a fear that you will not preserve the current position, which is that Northern Ireland has an open border both to the Republic and to the United Kingdom. So whatever solution you have, people talked about border in the Irish Sea. That doesn't resolve the problem. That's still a border. And for the nationalist community, having a border of any sort, or a stronger border, a deeper border, I should say, is a political red line. And for the unionist community, having a border with GB is a red line. And I can understand where they're both coming from, because it's important, almost psychologically, for the agreement to work, that you can have these open borders and that you can have the free movement of people across both of those borders.
Thank you. Rupa Huq.
I was just going to ask, to some extent you've answered it, I think, but just this binary model of devolved latitude and centralised supremacy of Westminster, unity and diversity, whatever we call it, can this twin-track strategy continue after departure?
You're referring to the division of competences between the two levels. Well, yes, the feature of devolution in Scotland and Northern Ireland and now in Wales is a pretty clear division of powers between the two levels because of the reserve model, that everything is devolved if it's not explicitly reserved. And that has a number of advantages. One is it's pretty clear where any given competence lies. There have been very few disputes. In Scotland, almost none between the UK and the Scottish Government, one or two in Wales in the transition. It also allows the devolved governments broad capacity to make policy. They don't have to keep on going back to the statute book and seeing whether they've got the power to do one thing or another. They can mix and match policies in various ways. And it allows greater transparency and accountability because we pretty much know where powers lie. And that's worked pretty well compared with other systems. But inevitably, there are areas of overlap. There are commonalities. And there have been arrangements put in place to deal with those in the devolution settlement. Now, after BrExit, those common areas may increase. Similarly, with the recent devolution of some welfare powers, there's more overlap. And some of my colleagues in political science will tell you that's fine, that's the way the world is, let's not go for these watertight divisions of powers. But there are problems there. And I think the model we have in Scotland is a good one because it does make for clarity. So the more you move from separated or devolved and reserved powers towards shared powers, then the more problems you get about deciding who can do what. There are problems of transparency, knowing who's accountable for what. And these intergovernmental arrangements that are used for managing joint affairs tend to be precisely that, intergovernmental, and parliaments tend to be excluded. So where possible, governments across Europe have been trying to get away from that, trying to get some more clarity as to where responsibility lies, bearing in mind that there can never be complete clarity. There's always going to be some overlap, and we need mechanisms for dealing with that.
So how can shared powers and frameworks fit within the reserve powers model?
Right. Now, the term frameworks has just come into the debate as a result of BrExit. We never talked about frameworks before. And we don't have framework laws within the UK devolution settlement. A framework law is a law where both levels have responsibility for a given policy field. The higher layer sets the parameters, and within that, the devolved or the federated units can make policy.
So is this the same as what an EU law we'd call shared competence?
The EU law is based upon that.
A shared
principle.
competence.
Yeah. The EU operates on that principle. We don't operate on that principle. But if we're going to download EU frameworks into the United Kingdom Constitution, then we've got to work out what that means. And there's been very little thought given to that in the debate in the last few months, because it is a new principle. How would frameworks operate? How constraining would they be? How can we avoid the problems that have arisen in other countries? Because in Germany, they've got rid of framework laws. They're problematic in Spain and in Italy. How can we make sure that the system is going to work properly? And that if we're going to take over the European frameworks, are we going to operate them the way the EU does, or are we going to operate them in a different way? Because EU frameworks are negotiated, suggested by the Commission, adopted by the Council of the European Union, that's the Council of Ministers, with 28 member states, with qualified majority voting. We don't have anything like that. Subject to the principle of proportionality and subsidiarity, and you can go to the courts, the governments can go to the courts, parliaments can go to the courts if they think that's been violated, and then there's a legal mechanism to enforce those frameworks. We don't have anything like that in the United Kingdom Constitution. So it behoves us to think about that if we're moving towards that framework instrument, just what we mean and how would it operate.
Marcus Fysh.
So what other than having those discussions that you just mentioned, should we be doing to think about what is required, or what else should we be doing to do what is required to create and regulate a UK internal market while respecting the devolution settlements?
Well, you mentioned the phrase UK internal market, and that's something that's worth thinking about. It only features in the Northern Ireland Act. It doesn't feature in the Scotland and Wales Acts, but it's implicit. We sort of understand what that means. But once you get into detail about the UK single market, it becomes quite contentious. What about public procurement? What about state aid? Again, it's worth thinking about what that really means, what has to be uniform across the UK, and what instruments you need, not just to deal with the present-day problems, but to anticipate other things that might come up. One example of that from the European context is the minimum pricing of alcohol in Scotland that was introduced as a public health measure. Its opponents say, no, that's a single market measure. It violates the European single market. And it took several years to resolve. It went all the way up the court system and back down again here before it was resolved. So a general principle like that will have multiple interpretations. So we need to think, what does that principle really mean? And how can we put in place mechanisms to deal with it? The single market is the one that's been addressed, but there are other things about welfare. Well, what about different welfare rights and so on? How much commonality do we need there? That's a debate we never had at the time of devolution, because it didn't seem to be important, partly because Europe dealt with those kinds of things. But if Europe's no longer dealing with those things, then it's again worth thinking about what that might actually mean. And I say, ultimately, a lot of this is a matter of political judgment. So there's no scientific answer to what that means. It depends on your political predilections in many ways.
And what would be your comment on the extent to which the uniqueness of Northern Ireland's position within that means?
Well, Northern Ireland is obviously within the European single market. After BrExit, everybody in Northern Ireland wants to keep access to the UK market. They don't want obstacles there. But there's also an all-Ireland single market, which is really quite important. It's very important in agriculture. It's important in energy. It has some importance in some sectors as well. So how can you keep Northern Ireland with full access to both those single markets? Because they're important economically, but they're also extremely important politically. This notion of an all-Ireland market is a very important reference point for the nationalist community to be able to say to them, you don't need to separate, you don't need to get rid of the border, because you still have access to the all-Ireland market and can participate in many ways in the social, cultural and political life on an all-Ireland basis.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on to David Jones.
Professor Keating, as you know, the government has now made proposals to amend the EU withdrawal bill so that the presumption will be that repatriated powers will reside at a devolved level, and that Westminster will only have a role in terms of making temporary regulations to protect the UK internal market or to carry out international obligations. And that, of course, has already been accepted, I think, by the Welsh administration. How significant a change is this to the bill?
It is a significant change because initially Clause 11 says that all retained EU law will go back to Westminster until such time as the UK government will release the powers. They then shifted and said, well, we can release some powers immediately, and then they said there will be a limited list of powers, and then they said that we will release all powers will go back to the devolved, except the ones we specify, reversing that assumption of reservation of powers. And that was a very significant move. And on their side, the devolved government said, we will accept frameworks. We have no problem with frameworks. It just depends on how they're negotiated. And then the UK government said that this reservation of powers, which will be done by statutory order, will have a sunset clause and it will be subject effectively to the Sewell Convention, which statutory instruments normally aren't. So these were considerable moves, I think, that are really very important. That really got us back to the status quo ante, because that got us back to the position we had before. Assumption of reservation, consent for change of that, the Sewell provision for changing that. But it didn't resolve a problem that was there even in the old system, which is what happens when legislative consent is not given. Now, that problem has been avoided hitherto. Governments have got around it. Both governments have respected the division of competence. But with BrExit, it's very difficult to do. Now, that Sewell Convention was reinforced following the Scottish independence referendum in the Scotland Act of 2016 and the Wales Act of 2070. It was written down, but as the Supreme Court reminded us in the Miller case, it still wasn't legally binding. That raises the interesting question of how binding it is. What is a convention? And I've argued before that a convention is not a binding law, but it's not just a political agreement either. Conventions are the basis for our constitution, the unwritten constitution we have in this country. And both levels have, for obvious and very good reasons, tried to avoid facing that question because it doesn't have an answer. So let's just work around. Now it is posed. And the latest amendment that the UK government has tabled says the Sewell Convention will apply, in so many words. They restate it. But then they say if legislative consent is given, or legislative consent is withheld, or there's no answer to the request for legislative consent, the outcome will be exactly the same. So they've chosen to highlight this anomaly in the thing. We've got a convention, but it is not enforceable.
But nevertheless, that's been accepted by the Welsh
the Welsh government has accepted it, and the Scottish government hasn't. There is a difference there. But as I say, that's always been there in the devolution settlement. It's just been highlighted by the BrExit debate and the need to do something about these competences.
Does it matter that it's been highlighted, given that everybody knew it was there all the time?
Yes, because here I'm not speaking as a lawyer because I'm not a lawyer, but politically, this was a compromise. Politically, it was saying, yes, we'll respect your competences, but we'll have a fallback where we will be able to legislate anyway, and we'll try not to talk about it. But once you write it down in such an explicit way, then
people
you could
start
say,
talking
well,
about it.
We're just drawing attention to that anomaly and we're not resolving it.
Yes. Well, to what extent do you think that the latest proposals actually respect the constitutional balance under the devolution settlements, which is, I guess, what we've just been talking about? But
yes, they do. As I say, the UK government has moved and it's accepted the principle of reservation. It's accepted that the Sewell Convention should apply and even extended it to statutory instruments. But on the other hand, you could say that the Sewell Convention post-Scotland Act of 2016 and Wales Act of 2017, when it has failed its first test, because those two acts were supposed to resolve the question by saying this is the situation, but in a very ambivalent way. And just when it would really mattered, you could say it failed the test because the UK government says ultimately it doesn't make any difference.
But that, of course, as you rightly say, is set out on the face of both the Scotland and the Wales Act. So it was, if you like, expressly ambivalent.
But we knew that in law, so the Supreme Court didn't tell us anything new.
Yes.
But what is the difference between the black letter law and a constitutional convention? That is the big question, because most of our constitution is based upon conventions. And following the Scottish referendum and the Smith Commission and the two acts I referred to, there was an understanding emerging in practice that the UK government wouldn't just intervene just because it wanted to. And that was being respected. Brexit now then has put a burden on that convention that's just not capable of bearing. And it hadn't had time to bed in before Brexit came along. That's why we got ourselves into this position. The fudge that was in there doesn't work for Brexit. And so we've got these two interpretations of the Constitution clashing. Now, I can't speak for either government, but it seems to me that it's implicit in there, right when I was talking about the nature of the state, is it unity of the state or whatever, it's always been implicit they have two visions of the Constitution, but they're always able to work around them. Here we now have an instance of it becoming very explicit. Now, I don't know what's going to happen on Wednesday. Maybe there will be a compromise, but I'm just trying to explain where the two sides seem to be coming from and where these two visions of the Constitution do clash.
To what extent does the acceptance by the Welsh government of this proposal put pressure on the Scottish government, if you like, to fall in line?
Well, I don't know. That's a political question. Obviously, the Scottish government is more exposed than it was in the past, and the fact that the Welsh government is not a nationalist, pro-independence government made a difference to that. But I think what is being defended here, and I don't make any comment about whether the Scottish government are right in maintaining their opposition. This is an issue about the nature of the Constitution and whether we are to see this as some kind of deeply entrenched federal arrangement or not. And the understanding in Scotland was, following the referendum, that the devolution settlement would be more strongly entrenched some way or other. And we've not got there yet. We've not got the kind of understandings that we need to make this system work. Because this may come up again. And it's not just over the withdrawal bill, but these clauses will have a 7-year sunset clause, up to 7 years, 2 plus 5. But we may still need frameworks after that. So this may come up again and again. And the other concern I have with the way that the two sides have gone about talking about the division of competencies is that instead of talking about general principles like the internal market we're discussing now, and saying, well, how can we have some general principles for operating across the UK? They've gone into individual, very detailed competencies. And that might be too wide a list, or it might be too narrow a list, because we don't know what's going to come up in the future, particularly with regard to international trade deals. So whatever happens, there's got to be some longer-term mechanism for dealing with this problem.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a supplementary? In his February speech about Clause 11, basically, David Lidington said, and I quote, "Nor would this proposed arrangement prevent the devolved governments from doing anything that is already within their competence," unquote. How much do you give your assent to that assertion?
Well, it just at that stage we didn't know what the framework was going to look like. We didn't know what they were going to contain, but certainly within the EU frameworks, the Scottish government has a very large room for discretion, because within agriculture it has all the discretion that the UK government has as a member state is devolved down to Scotland. So there is a very distinct capacity for making policy there. It depends on what the frameworks would mean, and I think it's becoming clear now what they would mean, and I don't think the UK government is engaged in any kind of power grab. I don't see why they would want to do that. I think there's just been a neglect all the way through the process of the nature of the devolution settlement and the way it works. And I'm thinking about the longer term, how policy will be made in the longer term, what issues will come up in the future. And I'm just worried that if we get a short-term settlement to get the withdrawal bill through, we won't have the mechanisms in place for the next time this comes up, which it may come up in relation to foreign trade deals. It may come up in relation to reinterpretation of the single market.
So you're hoping that eventually the Scottish Government will accept this compromise, or perhaps a bit more of a compromise, but will they accept a compromise?
Well, I don't know. So that's a matter of political judgment. But what I do know is that however this list of powers is resolved, it's not going to provide a long-term solution to this problem.
No. Okay. Kelvin Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. I wonder if you could briefly explain what the Scottish withdrawal from the European Union Legal Continuity Scotland Bill is and what it would do.
Yeah, well, I was hoping that my colleague Ian would be here to explain the legalities of it, but I'll try and do my best. That it would incorporate directly into Scottish law all those repatriated European competences that lie within the competence of the Scottish Parliament, and in that way preempt the withdrawal bill in the form, well, whatever form it takes, by saying, well, the powers immediately come back to Scotland. Now, that's going to the Supreme Court, and I have no idea what the Supreme Court will say. That clearly is a political gesture to say, because the UK government, we know, can get its way anyway. Whatever the continuity bill says, Westminster can countermand that if it really wants to, Sewell Convention notwithstanding. There's a political battle about that, but it also says one or two other interesting things as well, which may survive even if the withdrawal bill were withdrawn. One is that it incorporates the Charter of Fundamental Rights from the European Union into the law of Scotland, so that those repatriated competences would be subject to the Charter. Now, there's also a debate about this in the House of Lords as well, whether that should be done for the UK as a whole. And secondly, it would allow Scotland, or give Scottish ministers the powers unilaterally to align with European regulations in areas that are devolved, so that Scotland would remain closer to European regulations and European rules, so keeping its effective capacity to work within European policy systems within devolved fields. And those other two things, it seems to me, are quite interesting and worth thinking about, because they don't challenge the Union or challenge Westminster supremacy. They open up the possibility that of the devolved territories maybe having a slightly different relationship with European regulations than the rest of the United Kingdom does.
And you don't think the United Kingdom government would be hostile to it necessarily? It strikes me as being a bit of a belt and braces bill. You know, if the withdrawal belt doesn't cover all bases, your bill would fill in the gap, so to speak.
Well, it would mean that the last bit would mean that Scottish ministers have the power effectively to adopt European regulation. Now, the Scottish Parliament could do that anyway by primary legislation, but it provides a mechanism for Scottish ministers to be able to keep up with European regulations as they change. That's just a matter of public policy. Preempting the withdrawal bill, that seems to me essentially a political issue, because ultimately we know that Westminster can get its way if it wants to. Even if the Supreme Court allows this bill, Westminster could say, no, we're not going to permit it.
You could take in parallel legislation to the EU legislation itself, but you wouldn't necessarily, obviously wouldn't be governed by the European Court of Justice or anything of that kind. It would just be imitating what the EU has done and adopting similar laws.
Yes.
Which UK is going to do anyway, I think, in many cases.
Well, we don't know. We don't know how far the UK is going to maintain alignment with European regulations on whatever basis in order to keep access to the market. But yes, indeed, that would allow the Scottish Government to go further than the UK in that regulatory line. And also, the European Court of Justice would not, of course, have control over these things, but it could even incorporate decisions of the European Court of Justice, which a lot of the single market comes from, the way it's interpreted by the court.
Just going back to one of your previous comments, it's always struck me that Scotland is, in philosophical terms, to the left of the rest of the UK, well, certainly England. And if you look at free university tuition, free long-term care, public ownership, water, and so on, and you specifically referred to public procurement and state aids, which would be outside what the EU would allow, but something that might be very popular in Scotland, and certainly I would support that personally. But do you not think that it would provide opportunities for Scotland to pursue its much more social democratic, even socialist agenda?
That's possible. The free personal care just doesn't come into this at all because it's got nothing to do with European regulations. The fee regime obliges Scotland to allow European students to come to Scotland and study without paying fees. And that obligation would go after BrExit. State aids and public procurement, that's the kind of thing that might come into UK single market regulations. But whatever conception we have of a UK single market would probably have some common regime about state aids. Otherwise, you get unfair competition or a race to the bottom in subsidies across the United Kingdom, and nobody would really want that because it'd just be destructive for everybody. But I think what Scottish parliamentarians, because not just the government, might have in mind would be environmental regulation. We could, if it were the case that the European standards were higher than UK standards, or the Scottish government could go for that higher level. Regulations in animal health. Labour market regulation is not devolved, but there is a case for arguing that that's the things people are talking about. Maybe that would be devolved in the future. So it's a relatively small area. It doesn't cover the main issues of economic or welfare policy, but it's just a way in which Scotland could stay a bit closer to the EU than the rest of the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Moving on to... Oh, yes, Marcus, you wanted to chip in.
Yes, please. I just wanted to ask what would happen if the UK Parliament were unable to pass the EU withdrawal bill. Would this continuity bill be able to be implemented?
Yes, I assume so. I mean, if the UK government weren't able to pass the withdrawal bill, do you mean if it were voted down?
If it were voted down, if it wasn't possible to get it through the House of Lords, if they just point blank refused to approve it, and we had to use the Parliament Act, and it took 2 years.
Well, yes, I think you'd have a constitutional crisis there, and the Scottish issue would be a sideshow. I think I don't think that's going to happen. There's no evidence that the House of Lords would be attempting to do that. But just imagine that the withdrawal bill were to disappear, then I suppose the continuity bill would be there. But whether the Supreme Court will accept it, because the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament says it's not competent. The Lord Advocate says it is competent. So there's an argument amongst lawyers as to whether it is competent. And I can't answer that question because I'm not a lawyer.
Well, we will find an answer from someone else. Thank you. We're going to have to skip along a little bit more quickly if we're going to keep to time. So can I ask colleagues and our witness, please, to give short and crisp answers. We're moving on to David Jones.
Yes. What mechanisms exist in the Scotland Act to ensure that all areas, all parts of the UK comply with international obligations entered into by the British government?
Yeah, there's a clause saying that the UK ministers can, I won't give you the precise wording, I don't remember it, I'll give you the gist, can instruct Scottish ministers to give effect to international obligations. It doesn't instruct the Scottish Parliament, it instructs Scottish ministers. Whether that would override the Act of the Scottish Parliament, you'd have to ask a lawyer. There's been a question of whether that is the right kind of power to have, because it's not being used as far as I know. And certainly it was intended as some kind of backstop, unless there was some kind of emergency, some problem of non-compliance, which there has not been. But as more and more regulation ceases to be European law and becomes international treaty law, including our future relationship with the EU, and then trade deals with third parties, the number of cases where that arises is going to be much greater. I think it would at least looking at that and seeing whether that power is adequate, whether it is something that could be incorporated in a general set of principles. I was talking about frameworks before as a principle that we'd understand. Something like that, I think, would probably be more satisfactory than what was intended just as a fallback power. And then the other side of that, if there is a requirement that devolved legislatures as well as governments give effect to international trade agreements or other international obligations, it could be in the environment or anything, then those devolved institutions should have an input into the making of those treaties. Some kind of way in which they can express their concerns about what's in those treaties.
So to accommodate this, do you think that there is going to be need for new primary legislation amending the devolution settlements?
I don't know. Again, that's a legal question, and it just seems to me that power was intended for a different purpose. It was intended as an emergency override, and that if we're going to have a regular penetration of devolved law by international treaty instead of European law, there's probably a better way of doing it on a regular basis. And again, putting in place conventions whereby the devolved were at least consulted on how this might affect their devolved competences. Okay. I'm not talking about a veto, but some way in which they could be consulted.
Thank you.
Rupa Huq?
Yeah, we've heard several recommendations, even when we went to Cardiff on a similar visit, that intergovernmental relations need to be placed on a statutory footing now. What might such legislation look like, and what mechanisms would be needed to be put in place to formalise these?
I wouldn't start with institutions and committees and mechanisms like that, because if you set up institutions without giving them something to do, then they atrophy. This is what happened to joint ministerial committees. They just stopped meeting because there was nothing to talk about. I'd start with general principles. Going back to this notion of what the single market is, going back to this idea about what are the implications of international agreement, start at that point. You might have to address the status of the Sewell Convention. In other devolved or federal systems, there is a fallback mechanism as to what to do when there is a deadlock. And in no case does it say the central parliament will just resolve the matter. I haven't found a single case where that happens. There's always some mechanism for constitutional amendment involving the devolved or federated units, usually involving qualified majorities, the second chamber, some way in which, when there is deadlock, the centre can't unilaterally get its way. And once you've established that principle, then everything else follows, because it provides an incentive to cooperate. You know what the rules are, you know what the fallback is, you don't want a constitutional crisis. And so the devolved level is not simply saying, well, we'd like you to take our position into account, but we realise you don't have an obligation to. Now, if you have that mechanism, then I think you can build on that. You can identify ways in which to avoid that kind of conflict. And then I would work around policy fields. The problem with the joint ministerial committees is that they only worked where there was a policy field that was really relevant. And so they worked in relation to the European Union, because you need, before the meetings of the European Council or the Council of the European Union, to have common positions. They work to some degree in agriculture, because there's a lot of common interest there. In Spain, they do this with what they call sectoral conferences. They look at the big policy fields and organize meetings around that. And they also have a mechanism for voting there, which says that, and I'm not saying we should reproduce this, but it's just interesting that there is voting. The central government has the same number of votes as the autonomous communities put together. So neither side can overrule the other side without getting some support there. So some kind of underpinning would be extremely useful, because it wouldn't just there wouldn't be the possibility of unilateral imposition. And then some serious thought about where these issues might arise. And most issues we can forget about. Where are these going to be important? What are the important fields? And put in mechanisms to deal with those.
I mean, just in Cardiff, it felt that they hadn't got their meeting yet with... I think David Liddington was due to meet them. I don't know, they felt a bit forgotten, and they... we've not had the equivalent session here yet.
There were complaints about the Joint Ministerial Committee on European Negotiations from both Scotland and Wales.
I think you described it, set out a set of general principles. What would this set of principles look like? Is there anything like that in existence at the moment?
No, there isn't. This is where we get back to frameworks and what should be in frameworks. And my suggestion that frameworks shouldn't have detailed list of competencies to argue about, but broad principles and some way to interpret those.
About how to conduct intergovernmental relations.
Yeah, or what a single market looks like. What kind of things do we think might be important? Broadly defined, so we don't have to creep on.
But in terms of the basic set of principles for intergovernmental relations, I mean, you have in your mind's eye what that would look like.
Yes, it would require. Well, it would require a recognition in Westminster that there are circumstances where it won't get its own way.
Very challenging.
That is very challenging. That's a challenge to Westminster sovereignty, where we started off. But that's what a constitution, a devolved constitution, a federal constitution, looks like. That's the critical one. And if you have that, I think you might reduce the number of conflicts, because there'll be an incentive to agree.
Kelvin Hopkins?
Yes, my question really follows on from what Rupa and Cheryl have been saying about intergovernmental relations. If they are formalised, what role should there be for parliamentary scrutiny rather than the executive? For example, should there be an inter-parliamentary council with a scrutiny role, or should that role fall to the individual parliaments and assemblies? And I think one of the significant points here is that most members of the European Union have different electoral systems to us, which tends to give more power to legislators than to executives. And I think that's probably true of Scotland and Wales as well, that England, because it's first past the post, strongly gives very great power to the executive. So what role for Parliament?
Yes, the question of England, of course, by the way, is one we haven't come to. I think it's a really big one, which has to be resolved. Who speaks for England? But as far as the parliaments are concerned, yeah, this is a weakness in the present system. In all countries where you have a lot of intergovernmental relations, parliaments tend to be marginalised. Agreements are made in closed forums; they're not subject to scrutiny. There's a problem of accountability, and that really does need to be addressed. And I know all the legislatures around the United Kingdom have been concerned with that. There's been some experimentation around this in relation to the European Union and how European policy making works, because the same criticism is made that how do we control our governments who go to the Council of the European Union and negotiate on our behalf. And there are places, Denmark is one example, where ministers have to come to the Parliament before and after meetings. They have to explain what the negotiating remit is. They have to explain afterwards what they've done. And as I keep on telling members of the Scottish Parliament, you don't need the UK Parliament's permission to do that. You can just do that yourself. You can summon ministers here and tell us what they're doing when they go to London and negotiate. It requires a willingness on the part of the parliaments to exert themselves. And then on the interparliamentary dimension, again, I think it would be extremely useful to have more contact amongst the parliaments. There is a common shared interest in scrutiny of executives there that transcends any partisan political divisions. There have been moves in that direction, but the problem with these things is that people always say, we don't have time, or we're too busy doing other things. But again, they could, if they were prepared to invest time in that, get much better coordination, joint meetings, joint inquiries in common problems. So there's a lot, without changing the devolution settlement, without changing the law, there's a lot more could be done.
Just a brief comment. There are 3 members of our team today who are members of the European Scrutiny Committee at Westminster as well, and there is some tension between the EU Scrutiny Committee and government and ministers. Getting ministers to come to talk to us is sometimes quite difficult. Anyway, it's just a comment.
Indeed.
Marcus, Fysh?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, you referred earlier, Professor Keating, to what a federal system looks like. That is what it looks like. What would be the constitutional implications of making intergovernmental and interparliamentary relations more of a permanent feature of the constitutional settlement? And you mentioned the England question. Obviously, that would have to be addressed.
Yeah. Well, can I come to England then? Because I think that's one of the biggest issues within this. Who speaks for England? Is the UK government, or is there a separate voice for England? The difficulty fitting England into the constitution is that within England itself, there's no consensus about how that should be done. English votes for English laws, is that the answer? An English parliament, not a lot of support for that. English regions, well, that was tried. City regions is being tried at the moment. It doesn't resolve this particular problem. So we just have to work around that. But it does mean that whatever system we have is going to be asymmetrical in a very serious way, in a way that doesn't exist in any other country, where 85% of the population belongs in one unit. There have been suggestions in relation to intergovernmental machinery and whatever comes out of BrExit and these new frameworks, that there should be a separation between England and the UK. Ministers attending this should be English ministers or UK ministers. It happened a bit in the past in the Joint Ministerial Committee for Europe. One minister was given the responsibility of speaking for England and another was presiding on behalf of the UK. I think that's the way we'll probably be moving, but as long as there's no consensus within England about how this is going to be handled, then it's very difficult to do anything. People here talk about a federal UK, but if the English don't want that, then we've got no right. We can't impose on the English something that they don't want. We've just got to work around it.
Just as a follow-up, Chair, I'm also on the International Trade Committee of the House of Commons, and one inquiry that we're intending to undertake is the way that we achieve buy-in of the different parts of the political economy for potentially thinking about new international treaty obligations. And I was just wondering whether you thought that giving the constitutional discussions a practical tasks such as that might be a context in which to experiment with such new ways of talking to each other.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital that the joint committees be given a job to do. Otherwise, people just don't turn up. So yeah, it might be useful to start off with some key issues and say, let's work on that, and then see how the practice develops from that.
Yeah, and are there any other spheres of public life other than international trade where you think that would be important?
Well, everything that might be covered by UK frameworks which would be to do with the single market and things like competition law, notably. People talk about state aids, but that's just a subsidiary category of a much bigger thing called competition law, which is downloaded from Europe. Environmental policy is another one, common resources, cross-border issues, infrastructure. These are the kinds of things where it might be useful to work on concrete tasks. Like a lot of the stuff that's done in Ireland across the border is about very specific things, hospitals, roads, bridges, where there's a clear task and a clear common interest.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Professor Keating, it's been fantastic. How we'd have fitted you in to the hour we allocated if Aileen McHarg had been there as well, I don't know, but we've been hanging on your every word. It's been a really fantastic session. Just one last thought. What else should we do or can be done to build up more trust and mutual respect between Westminster and Holyrood?
Well, I think trust comes from institutions. Trust comes from knowing what the rules are, and it comes from practice. And following devolution, we didn't have the crises that people thought we'd have. We even got through the Scottish independence referendum, and were able to put together a system after that, get agreement on a new bill, and get agreement on the Sewell Convention, until BrExit came along. That produced a shock to the system. And even with various combinations of different political conventions, a lot of common work did go on. So I don't subscribe to the notion that there was any kind of crisis in devolution. I think the arrangements were generally working, but they could have been improved. But trust stems from knowing that the other side has got to cooperate with you and you've got to cooperate with them. That's a hard-headed view of what trust is. It's not people being nice to each other. It's people knowing there are games here, there are rules, and we've got to play by those rules. But where there's that uncertainty and where one side ultimately holds all the cards, it's very difficult to get that trust relationship.
But surely trust is an act of faith, isn't it? It's not about knowing the other side's obliged to do something.
Well, I'm supposed to be the airy-fairy academic, and you're the hard-headed politicians. I think it's about power as well. I think that really does matter.
Well, thank you very much, and it's been extremely good. We're going to take a 20-minute adjournment now to catch our breath before our next panel. Order.
Okay.
Is currently suspended.